Boa noite. Boa noite. This is a wonderful night, isn't it? Só uns minutinhos mais, existem algumas pessoas ainda na fila do equipamento, ok? O equipamento de tradução. Então, a gente vai aguardá-las, tá? Para nós começarmos a nossa cerimônia oficial de abertura do 10º EGEPE. Prometeremos que a parte official, né, será bem breve e vamos deixar a maior parte do tempo para vocês desfrutarem da professora Saras Sarasvathy. E então, depois da apresentação dela, nós teremos o nosso get together, ou seja, o nosso coquetel, para a gente continuar aqui nossas teias de relações. E ela mesma já nos disse hoje que isso é extremamente importante, né? Ok? Então, só um pouquinho. Vocês já perceberam que o nosso próximo palestrante internacional já está aqui, né? Professor Hugo Cantes. Então, amanhã será a vez do professor Hugo Cantes com vocês, que, aliás, também vai ser em dose dupla. Amanhã na quinta e na sexta-feira. VRS. Ok? Acho que já podemos ir, tá? Então, boa noite a todos. Nesse 4 de julho, é uma data bem histórica, né? E histórica também para a EGEPE e para o EGEPE, porque nós temos, então, estamos na nossa efeméride de 10º Encontro Nacional de Estudos de Empreendedorismo e Gestão de Pequenas Empresas. Atualmente, já de uns anos para cá, organizado pela Associação Nacional de Estudos de Empreendedorismo e Gestão de Pequenas Empresas. E desta feita, né, nós, quando buscamos a instituição para podermos localizar o nosso 10º EGEPE, procuramos a Fundação Getúlio Vargas, na figura do professor Thales Andreassi, que imediatamente nos abriu as portas para que nós fizéssemos esse 10º encontro aqui, tá? Então, oficialmente, deixa eu já chamar o professor Thales Andreassi, nós vamos fazer rapidamente uma mesa de abertura, aliás, cadeira de abertura, numa mesa de abertura, né? Por favor, professor Thales, que é vice-diretor aqui da Fundação Getúlio Vargas, né? E a Esta, tá? Queremos convidar também uma pessoa que está aqui, fez questão de estar presente conosco, professor Antônio Carlos Gaston Massada, presidente da AMPAD, por favor. Pelo protocolo, seria eu, então eu me chamo a mim mesma, ok? Ok. Professor Edmundo... palmas, Professor Edmundo Inácio Júnior, ele é nosso diretor científico da EGEPE, mas ele está aqui também representando o diretor da Faculdade de Ciências Aplicadas da Unicamp. Vocês viram que, na verdade, esse evento está sendo feito numa cooperação tripartite, que é entre aqui a Fundação, a EGEPE e a FCA da Unicamp. Então, por favor, Edmundo Inácio. Edgar Barque, onde está? Edgar? Please, come. Não quer. Tá bom, então eu vou dizer que o Edgar Barque, professor Edgar Barque, ele é o coordenador do Centro de Empreendedorismo e Novos Negócios e também foi a pessoa com quem a gente interfaceou todo o tempo, fora a equipe dele, a Aline, que eu já nomino aqui, extremamente gentil e com as nossas inúmeras demandas, né, de um evento tão complexo quanto este. Tá? Então, indo para... Então, professor Tales, se você... Suas palavras, por favor.
Bom, bem-vindo a todos, a todas, sejam muito bem-vindos à Escola de Administração de Empresas de São Paulo, da Fundação Getúlio Vargas. Como a professora Rose mencionou, estou representando aqui a diretoria da FGV, a ESP, mas na verdade que eu sou mesmo professor de empreendedorismo há 25 anos. E eu estou realmente muito satisfeito de realizar, de poder receber vocês todos aqui na escola, de realizar o 10º EGEPE. Muito obrigado, Rose, pela confiança, por ter escolhido a FGV, a ESP, para sediar esse evento. Eu ainda me lembro que há alguns anos a EGEPE começou bem pequenininha, né, na sala de visitas da professora Vânia, né, e hoje a gente está aqui com centenas de pesquisadores, com uma revista bem qualificada, com uma associação forte, e isso porque a área de empreendedorismo, a comunidade de empreendedorismo é muito especial, né? É uma comunidade que publica junto, que pesquisa junto, né? Que torce pelo sucesso do outro, né? E eu tenho muito orgulho de fazer parte dessa comunidade. Gostaria de novamente agradecer a professora Rose, o professor Edmundo, o professor Barque e também o professor Leandro Bissoni, que é um professor aqui da escola e também de Darden, e que fez a ponte, o convite inicial para a professora Sarasvathy, que vai ser a nossa keynote speaker. Então é isso, sintam-se todos muito acolhidos aqui na ESP e espero que gostem, porque esse evento está muito bom, com vários cursos. Parabéns aos organizadores. Muito obrigado.
Obrigada, professor Tales. Então, agora eu pediria ao nosso convidado, professor Massada, também para fazer a sua fala.
Boa noite a todos e a todas. Gostaria de agradecer à professora Rose pelo convite, já que foi falado em ponte anteriormente aqui, falar para o professor Emil Hoffman, que é o diretor científico da Ampart, que também está aqui presente e tem um painel amanhã, né? Eu já estou fazendo um jabá para que todos participem, vai ser muito bom, né? Mas eu quero agradecer e quero parabenizar o encontro do empreendedorismo, que vem junto com algumas ações que a Ampart tem, mudando o nome da área de inovação para inovação, tecnologia e empreendedorismo. Isso foi uma vitória que surgiu de uma das colegas que fazem parte do grupo de empreendedorismo, e foi muito no nosso último evento realizado na Unicinos, na área de CIT, onde a gente definiu esse tema que é grandioso pela associação que tem hoje, pela presidente que está liderando todo esse processo, e a gente na Ampad vai tentar contribuir também com alguma coisa, né? No próximo Enampad também a associação, todas as associações vão receber uma correspondência onde nós vamos disponibilizar salas para as reuniões individuais de cada associação. Então a gente vai ter essa oportunidade e espero que todos tenham um grande evento. Eu espero amanhã participar de uma ou outra sessão, se a Rose permitir. Eu tenho o maior interesse, né? E desejo sucesso a todos e a keynote speaker que tenho garantia de show na sua apresentação. Obrigado. Parabéns pelo evento.
Muito obrigada, professor. Professor Edmundo.
Obrigado, boa noite a todos. Obrigado pela presença, obrigado pelo convite, Rose, de estar aí aí há 2 anos trabalhando junto com você nessa organização e na... assim.
Vai ter que me aturar mais 2 anos.
Seremos reempossados. Eu estou aqui só para passar alguns números para vocês, que esses números nos deixaram extremamente felizes. Que esse ano nós tivemos 324 trabalhos submetidos. O ano passado foram 247, então um aumento expressivo.
Posso fazer um comentário?
Sim.
Isso mesmo com um período de submissão quase que em paralelo com o evento da Ampad. Então vejam que isso realmente, tanto para vocês como para nós, representa de que a comunidade realmente está produzindo muito e muito ativamente. Tá?
E desses 324, 214 foram aprovados, e aqui a gente já deixa um grande parabéns aos 24 temas de líderes, né, dos 14 eixos temáticos, os 28 líderes dos 14 eixos temáticos, e aos mais de uma centena de avaliadores que fizeram um trabalho árduo em poucos meses, né, para a gente conseguir esse resultado. E desses 214, 193 fizeram o registro, o pagamento, e nós instalamos 193 trabalhos que estão sendo apresentados, então, nesses 2 dias e meios. O interessante é que nós temos, então, 20 estados participando. Entre vocês, os 20 estados brasileiros estão participando. A gente conclama aqui que no próximo, pelo menos, os 7 estados que ficaram fora, a gente possa ter representantes, que é o Espírito Santo, Mato Grosso, Tocantins, Paraíba, Maranhão, Rondônia e Acre.
Rondônia está aqui.
Não, Roraima, desculpa. Roraima e Acre.
Rondônia está lá, o Raul Fome.
Então, 20 estados brasileiros e mais de 80 instituições de ensino superior diferentes estão nesses 2 dias e meio com a gente. Então a gente está realmente muito contente, e uma salva de palmas para vocês que fazem nosso evento cada vez melhor.
Esquecendo, nós estamos we are becoming international. Nós estamos aqui com 4 países representados.
Argentina, Chile, Colômbia e Espanha.
Ok? Então, isso tudo realmente são sinais muito interessantes de que realmente existe essa produção, essa necessidade de estar interagindo, de estar debatendo, de estar compondo essas parcerias, e essas parcerias tanto entre pesquisadores, entre as instituições e entre as associações. Afinal de contas, nós somos de um país que tem recursos escassos, né? A gente tem que trabalhar muito na base de bricolagem, effectuation e por aí afora, né? Então a gente tem que aprender muito mais a fazer competition, na verdade, né? Então, na verdade, a gente tem que cooperar. Lógico, no momento a gente está competindo por publicação, a gente está competindo por melhor ranking do seu journal, da sua instituição, mas na maior parte dos casos a gente vai conseguir ir mais longe se nós cooperarmos, né? Então, cada vez mais a gente espero que a gente esteja nessa senda e que nós cooperemos muito mais entre nós, inclusive com a América Latina, tá? Eu faço essa observação porque nós, como um país que fala português, nós viramos as costas para a América Latina, tá? A gente não se dá conta, mas o fato da gente não fazer um certo esforço de aprender de fato a falar um pouco melhor o espanhol e não o portunhol, isso acaba dificultando a construção dessas pontes. E vice-versa, né? Então eu acho que a gente tem que olhar um pouco mais também para a América Latina. É certo que a gente, em termos de posições aí de revistas, etc., cada vez mais você tem que usar e publicar em inglês para entrar nas bases de dados e seja o que for, mas eu acho que tem como você construir isso com outras instituições, com gente da América Latina, Cara, e tem gente que é capaz de publicar em inglês com você também, tá? Então, vamos olhar isso, e é bom que no nosso evento, dessa vez, nós tenhamos gente dos Estados Unidos, como a professora Saras, mas também o professor Hugo Cantes, e temos também o professor Camilo, que é do Chile. Cadê o professor Camilo? Lá em cima. Aliás, o professor Camilo, eu conheci já no evento do professor Hugo Cantes, que é o criador do Prodem, em maio. Então, isso já resultou nessa vinda do professor Camilo para cá. Tá? Então, sem mais delongas, declarado oficialmente, vamos lá para a nossa keynote speaker. Ela vai falar para nós sobre Applying Effectuation Theory to Exploit New Entrepreneurial Opportunities. Falando oficialmente não vou ler o CV, ou aliás, o currículo dela, senão já passaria a noite toda, tá? Então, professora de Sarasvathy é da Darden Graduate School of Business, University of Virginia. Academic Positions and Work Experience. Presentemente, ela é Paul Hammaker, Professor of Business Administration, da University of Virginia. E ela é Ramuna Raghavan, Chair Professor of Entrepreneurship, do Indian Institute of Management, Bangalore, India. Eu penso que seja suficiente como introdução. Professora Saras, por favor, we thank you very much for your coming here, having been a very pleasant presence. You are very energetic, very flexible, and now people want to listen to you and not to myself. Please come.
First of all, it's a pleasure to be here. So I can say, boa noite. I've been doing several different things since I got to Brazil on Sunday, but this is definitely the best, because there's nothing more pleasurable than just talking to colleagues, right? That we are co-travelers on the same journey. So it's a privilege and a pleasure to be here. So thank you for taking the time to be here as well. So even though the program actually said a different title, Applying Effectuation to Exploiting New Entrepreneurial Opportunities, Rosie actually asked me to do two things at least. One is definitely introduce effectuation for people who may not have known about it, but don't spend all your time on that, right? But to talk about some of the newer research and things that are, so that's why I put the title as New Insights and Possibilities. So the opportunities can be about entrepreneurial opportunities, but they can also be research opportunities, so however you want to. But if you have specific questions along the way, instead of doing like a standard keynote speech, I would love to keep it interactive. So if you have questions, no need to wait till the end to ask the questions. Raise your hands anytime. And in that spirit, I'm going to start with a question, which is, how many of you have either never heard of effectuation or know virtually nothing about it? And I'm deliberately phrasing the questions that way because in academia, we take pride in knowing things, right? We don't take pride in not knowing things. So I'm deliberately asking you this because in a way, if you think about it, research has to be about the things we do not know, right? So I tell my PhD students when they come in that every degree that you have gone through till now, right, has made you unfit for the PhD. Because every degree, all the good reasons why you actually got into this room are going to be hindrances now. Because now you have to get comfortable with never being the smartest person in the room, ever again, right? Because no matter what you learn and become expert in, there are going to be amazing people who have thought about something else very, very deeply. And to begin with, everybody is really, really smart anyway, right? I got to work with Herbert Simon in my dissertation period, and he used to say that I am smarter than the other person, I know more than the other person is a very bad research strategy, right? So to welcome you in terms of being co-travelers in research, I am phrasing my question in terms of ignorance. So I would love to know if you've never heard of effectuation, or maybe you glance at a paper, but you don't know anything much about it, you don't do anything in that. I'd like to know how many people are there so that I don't spend a lot of time just explaining it if there aren't enough people. So how many of you have never heard of it, or hardly? Oh, don't feel shy. See, this is your chance to be a true academic and say, I do not know. All right. Okay, very good. Thank you for raising your hand. So this at least justifies my spending a little bit of time wasting some of the other people's time in explaining what this is. But I'm also going to try and explain it through research in a way. So even if you might have read something on effectuation, you may not know like what was the research that went behind it. And so if you're interested, I hope you will find some interest in what I have to say on that as well. Okay, so let's get started. So this is kind of what's been happening with effectuation. I get a lot of credit for what people around the world are doing in terms of research, teaching, and also in terms of the actual entrepreneurs who are practicing effectuation and writing to me and giving me material. I mean, there are 1,000 people or more that I have to thank for a lot of the things that I bring to the table. But I thought as researchers, you might be interested to know, I finished my PhD in 1998. And in 2001, the paper appeared in the Academy of Management Review, that is the one that everybody cites for it. But you can see, just take a look at how long it took. So the first paper appears in 2001, and the first empirical paper, even though the theory actually came from the data, which I'll tell you in a minute, the first empirical paper was published only in 2009. And then in 2014, you can start saying suddenly something is happening, right? So for those of you who are young scholars, and you have just come up with something exciting, you know it's exciting, you know it's important, you care about it, and nothing is happening, let me just tell you, you are not alone, right? So it took a while, but now it's gone crazy, right? Now it's like, who thought of that? I definitely did not think this would happen. So it's gone crazy now. So we just had the 5th International Effectuation Conference in June, and so as part of that, Stuart, one of my colleagues from very early on that I worked with, he did this calculation, he went and looked at the review, and he said, do you know I counted 755 papers because I did a literature review a couple of years ago, and we don't know what it is today, of course. And I know, like, since this February, there were 4 other papers that were accepted, because sometimes when papers get accepted, people send them to me. So I know that there are at least 4 more this year. And then last year, the Academy of Management also acknowledged the original paper by giving that paper the Foundational Paper Award. So this has been the story, research-wise, of effectuation. Now let me actually get into the research and show you, but since Rosie asked me to also talk about what's on my horizon, I thought I'm going to give you a glimpse of the little things that I'm doing. I'm going to touch upon some of these things in the keynote, but as I said, we'll keep it interactive, and if you have questions, you can ask me to go deeper in some of these, or if you don't ask the question, we won't go there, it's perfectly fine. So after the conference, one of the things throughout, I mean, a year and a half, maybe 2 years, we've been working on this, is actually, there is a special issue of small business economics on effectuation. So we've been working on that. Hopefully, we're very close to finishing it. By the end of summer, we would have everything put together, and then the journal will decide when it will actually go online, probably by the end of this year. So this is something, so a lot of the new and exciting work actually will show up there and not in my keynote. So just want to tell you that if you really want to look at the horizon, you might want to look at the special issue when it comes out. The other thing I have been working on in the last maybe about 5 years is this notion of an entrepreneurial method. And I'm going to talk about that just a little bit. And I'll also tell you how that came about, how that idea actually came about. And then I have another project, it's an empirical project that I've been working on for the last 5 years, again, which we call the Ask project. And I will tell you about that today for sure in the keynote. And the latest one that has just begun is the equity project. And many of my research projects, as you can see from the first slide I showed you, take 10 years, right? So now I know, I'm prepared that some of my work will take a long time to get out there. So working 3 to 5 years on a project is not something surprising. But I can talk about all of these things. Definitely I will talk about the entrepreneurial method and the Ask project, and if we have time, I will go into the equity project as well. So this is kind of the new stuff I want to talk about connected with effectuation, but I also want to introduce effectuation. Everything good so far? Please feel free to raise your hand, and if I don't notice your hand, you can even say hola, and that's fine, I will listen, right? So let me introduce the notion of entrepreneurship as a method. So over the years of building the research on effectuation and also working with people and seeing how this is progressing, one of the things, it became clearer and clearer that maybe what we are talking about is not just about starting companies, right? So it's not only about starting a company, it's actually a method, like the scientific method. It's like saying if you go back to the 15th century or 16th century, people only had these guilds, right? So a lot of the science that you did would have to do with how to build a bridge, or how to make a spinning wheel or something like that, right? But when Francis Bacon came along, he actually wrote this book, Novum Organum, in the 17th century, where he began, because he went and studied these engineers and artisans and people like that, and he wrote the book saying, that is a systematic method through which we can understand the universe. And as an academic, just to be historically more accurate, Francis Bacon was not the first person to write that, but before that, there was an Arabic philosopher who had already published a book in Arabic, Al-Hamdi, and he had written down the same ideas, so I do want to acknowledge that, but I still put Francis Bacon's book in here because Francis Bacon's book kick-started the education of science, right? So Francis Bacon's book, because it appeared around the time that a lot of the industrial revolution was happening, and also this idea that you don't have to die in the class or the caste or group in which you're born, that there are a lot of progressive ideas happening around that time, and part of that idea was to actually educate human beings, right? Let's actually educate everybody. And then this book allowed a lot of people to work on creating science education. And notice one thing interesting about the history of science, right? When this book was written and people started thinking about what do we do with this idea that we can systematically understand the universe, we don't need divine revelation, or it's not all luck that somebody comes up with something new. Once they started thinking about the systematic way, they did not go and teach only potential scientists, right? If they had taught science the way we teach entrepreneurship, we would never have gotten the 19th century or the 20th century, right? We would still be in the 17th century. Somebody did something right, and they decided to teach science to everybody. They made it part of normal education, whether you would become a scientist or not. What does that enable? It enables a society capable of reasoning, capable of thinking scientifically, capable of saying, you know, I too can figure it out. I can run an experiment, and I can use scientific reasoning in all kinds of things that I'm doing. I don't have to be a scientist to do it. So they made a society capable of science and capable of technology. And as a result of that, now Richard Feynman, the Nobel Prize winning physicist, talks about it, right? 97% of all living scientists that are living in the 20th century, right? So the idea was the number of scientists and the inventions, that thing just started going up. So 17th century, late 17th century, 18th century, the struggle begins to introduce into education. 19th century, they actually succeed in introducing in education enough so that a lot of people can get trained in science. And then 19th and 20th century, you get a lot of people actually following science, using science and becoming scientists, okay? So the idea here is, to some extent, the last 20, 30, 40 years of entrepreneurship research is allowing us to build the entrepreneurial method. And so my colleague Venkat and I argued in a paper that we should be teaching entrepreneurship to everybody, not just to potential entrepreneurs. So people always ask me, how do we build an entrepreneurial ecosystem? Exactly like we built a scientific ecosystem. We built it by teaching everybody in first grade, right? If you get the opportunity to go to school, you will learn science. You may not be great at it, you will never become a scientist, but everybody learns science. And the idea really, it has to begin there. So that's the argument we made in that paper, saying that entrepreneurship is a method, it is like the scientific method, and yet it is not the scientific method, right? Because the scientific method allows you to systematically understand the universe, to understand the world. The entrepreneurial method actually teaches you how to make new worlds, how to change the world, and it works in the human realm. But it is as much a method as the scientific method. So we began doing a lot of work connected with that. So this is one of the things that has been occupying my time in teaching, but also especially in talking to policymakers and educators and things like that. So this is something I wanted to share with you. And now let's go think about how does entrepreneurship, what is kind of at the heart of the entrepreneurial method? So in some ways, I think of effectuation as one of the major techniques, right? Like experimentation is a technique in the scientific method. I think effectuation is a very important part of the entrepreneurial method. And it's all about co-creating new futures. Now, let's again look at the analogy of science for a moment. Right? What has science actually enabled? So if I asked you, what has science allowed us to do? Besides, of course, create a lot of PhD students. Which also, by the way, there are graphs that will show you the connection between the publication of Novum Organum and the rise of PhD students. But what does science allow you to do? Yes?
Last definition of connected to knowledge is the definition of understanding.
Yes. Yeah. Of course, but what understanding nature, and that too many people now understanding nature, what has that allowed us to accomplish as a species, as a human being? Absolutely. 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 Innovation, technology, better ways of living. Absolutely. Thank you so much. This is why it's lovely to be with. Thank you. That is very thoughtful. So we know that, right? And so the question is, what can entrepreneurial method, and especially if we develop it the way we develop science, what can that allow us to do? And in connection with that, one of the interesting things that I found when I was studying, I was trying to learn about the history of science and what we have accomplished and how science education was developed, things like that. One of the interesting things is the connection between the scientific method and the rise of the middle class, right? There is a very interesting connection the idea that there is a systematic way to understand nature also allowed us to say if anybody can learn science, right? So there is a democratization, a philosophy of democracy already being built into science. You don't have to be privileged in some special way to be able to understand the universe. And that led to, and I correlated with a lot of other developments like, the Industrial Revolution, but also democracy itself. As a result of that free market, the idea of free markets, that you don't need a visible hand to coordinate the market, all of these ideas are linked in history. And as a result of that, we have the middle class. So people don't have to die in the station in which they are born. In fact, there is a beautiful story of an entrepreneur who built a venture, who built one of the most successful companies of the 18th century on this idea of social mobility. And that is Josiah Wedgwood in England. So Josiah Wedgwood makes pottery. You're smiling. We buy Wedgwood pottery even today, right? It's a very famous pottery. So in some ways the company exists even today. And you can buy Wedgwood pottery for your wedding. But potters, people who make pots, have been around since all of human history. And yet, so Josiah was born into a pottery family. So naturally he was just going to become a potter. But he had some disabilities growing up. So he could not physically work as much as his brothers could do. And so he used his brain a little bit more. And he would come up with new designs and new ideas to make pots and everything. So far so good. Sounds like, okay, he might be doing some innovation in pottery and maybe he'll make a little bit more money, whatever. And then, because he has this disability, in one of his trips, his leg bothers him and he's going into hospital in London. And his doctor introduces him to his later partner. Okay? Oh my God, I'm having a senior moment, I'm forgetting his name. Thomas something. And so he introduced him to this guy, and Thomas is actually a gentleman, right? Josiah is just a potter, whereas Thomas is a gentleman, upper class. He's a philosopher, but he's also involved in politics, things like that. But at the hospital, these two people meet and they talk all night. And Thomas has all these interesting ideas about democracy and about scientific method and about people actually, they can work their way out of their class into upper classes and stuff like that. And Josiah's imagination catches fire. And he decides, what does he know how to do? Pottery. So he says, I'm going to make pots and plates and vases the symbol of social mobility. So he builds a brand, and the way he builds a brand is he literally makes this a new design, full set of pottery and gifts it to the Duchess. And then the same pottery he sells to everybody, saying, now you can own a vase, you can own a plate, exactly the same as what the Duchess has, right? And people are willing to pay 4 times the price for his plates just because they have the same plate that the Duchess is using. So he builds a brand on this idea of social mobility. He tells people will pay money not for the plate but for their aspirations, right? And he builds one of the most successful ventures of the 18th century. You may or may not know this, but he was also the grandfather of Charles Darwin. And it was his fortune that allowed Darwin to go on the voyage of the Beagle, and the theory of evolution that influences all our lives today has come about from that. So this is what science can do. That science can actually lift people out of poverty into the middle class in some ways. So we started thinking about, now what can the entrepreneurial method do? Okay, so this is how the economy looks in most places, including the United States. In some ways, maybe worse than in the United States. So when you actually look at this, so there are lots and lots of tiny little ventures in the economy, right? These are the number of ventures. And this is the size, and size means over time, right? Over time, ventures can grow. And very, 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 very few will grow very, very large, right? But there's a whole bunch of things here. And the idea is, just like we build the middle class in the labor market, we should be able to build a middle class of business. And I think that's what the entrepreneurial method should allow us to do. It's not about building gazelles. It's not about building multi-billion-dollar companies, right? It's also not about encouraging, millions of people to just do subsistence entrepreneurship of some kind. It truly is to find people who are in the community, who are employing a few people, and then allowing them to grow. But we are not going to be teaching them to grow the business, right? We are just teaching entrepreneurship to everybody. And I'm saying that this growth will happen. Nobody set out to engineer the middle class, right? We are trying to engineer it now because of inequality and other problems that we have. So that's a different story. So this is kind of the dream behind thinking about entrepreneurship as a method and teaching it to everybody. Okay? So if you want a little bit more color on that, this is where the Ask project comes from. So what can we teach in an early stage entrepreneurship program to everybody, right? So we have to build the materials for us. So a lot of it, we have started building materials using effectuation. Now, effectuation is now being taught in first grade in several countries, right? People are taking this idea seriously. They're teaching entrepreneurship, but they're also teaching effectuation and many other things. So we said we have to build more materials. Just like in the early stages of the history of science, people built teaching materials to teach science to everybody. So it's connection with that we did the Ask project. So when you go and look at this curve that I showed you in terms of the numbers of ventures, if you look at where does all our money go and resources go, even training resources, right? We spend a lot of public money goes here. They're trying to get people to start things. They're trying to imitate Silicon Valley. You want to get people to, a lot of people should start companies, some of them will become gazelles, right? Those kinds of things are what people are doing. A lot of private money goes here. They're trying to find those companies that will become billion-dollar companies and then go public and stuff like that. But nobody is actually doing anything much around here. So we said, what can we do here? And we know from the jobs data that most jobs actually get created here, even in the United States. I always emphasize that. Most of the jobs are 95% of all new jobs. The larger companies are actually losing jobs. I actually looked at data on Silicon Valley. Let me ask you this question. If you put all the states, there are 50 states in the United States. If you rank them in terms of employment, percentage of people employed, where do you think California falls from 1 to 50? Take a guess. Fun? In the middle? Any other ideas? So something like 25? Much lower? Much higher? Much lower? It's 41. Silicon Valley creates a lot of jobs. In Beijing, right? In Bangalore, hopefully in Bogota, or in Sao Paulo. But the thing is, so when you think about this, from a perspective of educating an economy capable of entrepreneurship and also moving this frontier should be one of the things that we incorporate into teaching entrepreneurship. Our aim is not to target this. We're not going to target. Remember, we are going to create teaching for everybody. That's what we are engaged in. So the idea was just simply, so this comes directly from all the research in effectuation and the follow-on research that we have done, right? So just teach people how to ask. Learning just the idea that you can actually ask people, including ask strangers, right? This is one of the things that we found is important, and I'll show you inside effectuation how that came to be. But to learn to ask effectually is another thing. And this is not only about starting a company, it's about asking for anything. So I will talk about that a little bit more. So the Ask project fits into the entrepreneurial method project that we have been working on for a while, because this is one of the skills that expert entrepreneurs learn how to do. They learn it the hard way, but we find that this is something we can actually teach. So this is actual data of the same size distribution with this projection that if you can, for example, if you can take 10% of $200,000 companies and get them to become $2 million companies. And if you take 2% of $2 million companies and teach them how to be 20 million, that is way more jobs than the United States can handle, and they can employ all the immigrants coming in also, right? So that's what we projected and showed in this particular paper. So that's just a little bit of empirical color to the idea. So let's get to how some of these projects came about through my research on effectuation, how it's connected, but also you have to have like a basic understanding of effectuation if I have to explain to you what these projects are about. So as I said, people who know all about effectuation and teach effectuation, bear with me here a little bit. So the original study from which the ideas of effectuation came about came from this question. I had been an entrepreneur before coming into academia. I had started, co-founded 5 ventures, and I wanted to do something in education. And I truly wanted to understand what should I be teaching when I come and teach in a classroom. Because at that time, mostly we were teaching what I call toolbox issues, like how to do a business plan, how to do cash flow management, how to pitch somebody, how to incorporate, all very, very important issues, but they were teaching these toolbox issues, and they were teaching a lot of stuff about personality, right? That you have to be a risk taker, and you have to have confidence, and those kinds of stuff. And there was something from strategic management, some weird relationships between resources and performance, or capabilities, and I'm like, I am an entrepreneur. So I sat in class in my MBA program, and I said, I remember, starting my company, I have none of these things, right? So you have to start, if you're going to teach me something about this, you have to start by assuming I have nothing, number one. And second, you have to also assume there is no demand for my product, right? There is no demand function out there. Because I remember lying sleepless at nights thinking maybe there is no demand for my product that or my service that I'm offering. And so they were not teaching anything about starting with relatively nothing. Nobody, so I tell my students, I don't care if your father is a billionaire. As far as I'm concerned in this course, I'm going to assume you are a nobody with nothing. We start with that and then we build something, right? And so this is what I wanted to understand in my research. Like, if you have been an expert entrepreneur, which is you have had 10 years or longer, full-time immersive experience starting and running companies, you have started multiple companies, including failures and successes, and taken at least one company public. So the definition here is you have been through every possible experience that entrepreneurship can offer. What is it that you have learned that I can also learn and I can actually teach inside a classroom, right? So that was my very practical research question. I was extraordinarily lucky, I was fortunate. I was at Carnegie Mellon University, where they had already invented and used a method on studying expertise. And the method is called Think Aloud Verbal Protocols. So the way they do the research is they had studied experts in 200 different domains before I came and used the method for entrepreneurship. So the way you study, you use Think Aloud Verbal Protocol is it's not like an interview technique, it's more like an experiment. So you will go to someone who's an expert in their field, and you will ask them to actually do tasks that they do as an expert, but you ask them to talk continuously as they do the tasks, and you tape them, and you transcribe the tapes, and you analyze that. That's what you do. So I'll give you 2 examples. Suppose you have a doctor who is very, very good at diagnosing complicated medical illnesses, right? And you want to learn how to do that and teach that to your medical students. What you do is you don't go and ask the medical expert how do you do it, because people have theories of how do they do that, and that's not how they do it at all. So instead, you actually bring a patient file, right, with all the symptoms and complications and everything, and you tell this person, go through this file and start making your diagnosis, but talk continuously as you're making it. So now you get to see not just what diagnosis they make or why they think they're making that way, but you get to see what they do. What is the information they look first? What is the second? What is the third? How they actually make the decision. I'll give you one more example. If you have to multiply 24 by 32, And I tell you, you cannot use paper and pen, and you have to talk continuously while you do it, right? We will all struggle, even though we actually know how to do the arithmetic, but we will actually imagine, so some of us will imagine 24 times 32, so 4 times 2, and 2 times 2 is 4, and 4 times 3, we'll be doing this. But so I get to see as a researcher how you do arithmetic, irrespective of whether you got the answer right or not. In fact, in many cases, I can even tell you where you went to school and when. Because in different times and different places, they teach arithmetic differently, right? So it gives you a lot more information than if you just do interviews. So in my case, I use this criteria. There were 245 people in the world who qualified. I wrote to all 245 of them, and 45 people agreed to participate in the study. And I created a 17-page problem set of 10 typical decisions that all startups make. And so you can imagine you have all these entrepreneurs who have built ventures in many, many different industries, and we deliberately made sure that there was a lot of diversity in the industry experience. So they were not all software or biotech. The idea was to get an entrepreneurial expertise, right? So these are people from every kind of industry, but now they are looking at exactly the same problem set. And they have to talk continuously as they make marketing decisions, finance decisions, hiring decisions, and so on. And that is where the theory of effectuation actually came from originally. So when I started doing this, I started observing certain things that I wrote down, right, as the heuristics. Then looking at the data and analyzing and discussing with advisors and other people, it became very clear that these were not only just heuristics and principles, but there was a logic behind that, okay? And I'm going to tell you about that in a minute. But I also want to show you what has happened since then. Oh, okay, maybe I will talk about the logic. So the first thing I noticed, so I'm going all these different places, right? I'm literally flying over to them, and I'm putting this 17-page problem set in front of them, and I'm asking them, please start talking, right? They think it's going to be an interview, no matter what I tell them. These are busy people, very successful people. They think they're going to do an interview. They don't realize that for 2 hours, they're actually going to do homework, right? And so I start doing that. So I do the first one, the second one, the third one. And as a PhD student, I'm getting more and more nervous. I'm thinking, what is going on? They just sound like entrepreneurs talking, right? But I start noticing one thing, because I have to report to my advisor, what am I finding? The first thing I notice is they start saying, I hate market research. I don't believe in market research. I will not do market research. So I came back all excited and I told her, Simon, I think I found something. Expert entrepreneurs hate market research. He looks at me and he says, that's very interesting. But you do know that expert entrepreneurs hate market research is not a dissertation. He said, what do you mean by market research? Right? What do you mean by hate? Why do they hate it? Right? And if they hate it, what do they do instead? How exact? So he asked 1,000 questions that allowed me to go back to the data and analyze until like almost to the end of the data collection is when the big light bulb went off. That in actual fact, they are saying they will not use predictive information. In fact, one of the entrepreneurs actually said, oh, market research about the past is fine, right? But if somebody says, I will buy this or I will not buy this, I don't believe that. So they were truly talking about the future and predictive information. And when I went back and looked at it, in all of it, marketing, finance, in everything, even in hiring, they have actually become very, very good at making decisions in the face of an uncertain future without relying on prediction. So that's the logic behind all the principles, right? So the standard logic that we teach in marketing and finance and everywhere else is, yeah, the future is unpredictable, but let's try to get better at prediction, right? Because the better we predict, the more control we will have. And I think it is a totally worthwhile enterprise to develop better predictive techniques. I'm not against better predictive techniques. It is just that the expert entrepreneurs just went the other way. They said the future is unpredictable. Don't waste time or money or effort or energy in trying to predict it. So they had to develop some other ways of decision making that would not involve prediction at all. And that's the idea behind the causal and the effectual, because here you start with an effect that you want to create, and you spend all your time in trying to predict how best to create it. Here, you give up the, being tied to your effects. You just start with, what is it that I can actually do? What is already within my control that I can use? And then I'm more open to the kinds of effects I can create. And hence the name causal and effectual. Okay? So here we go. Since that original study, as I've told you, there have been hundreds of studies. This is just a very short map of some of the research that was just directly connected to the original study. So as you can see, expert entrepreneurs are very effectual. We also have a study that just recently came out I think International Review of Entrepreneurship, where we compared them with expert corporate managers, and they are up there. Then actually, if you look at novice entrepreneurs, they are all over the place, right? They're literally, because they are novices, they don't quite know. So if you just go and look at some of the early stage entrepreneurs, you will find everything, causal, effectual, just seat of the pants, right? I don't know what I'm doing. So you will find everything there. Then we started looking at investors. So we have a study of angel investors, and angel investors are very clearly effectual, and there's a good reason why, because many of them are actually cashed out experienced entrepreneurs. Then we looked at VCs, right? The novice VCs are very much like the corporate managers, because they usually come out of the corporate world, they come out of the banking world. But the more experienced the VC, the more effectual they get. So that is one of the interesting findings that we had. Then a colleague of mine actually looked at organic growth leaders within large corporations. These are people who created new top lines, right? New, not just product innovation, but actually revenue innovation, right? New revenue models for the company. And she found they were very effectual, but they also knew how to balance the causal. So they kind of came in between in some ways. Now we have also written, and when I say we, I literally, I mean, it's not me, there's hundreds of people. We have written over 200 case histories of companies around the world, different settings, but also social enterprise. We have looked at, as I said, across history as well, to literally show the generalizability of the model in some ways. And the generalizability has to do with the idea of the entrepreneurial method, right? So you cannot do science differently in one country than in another country. So if it is a method, it has to be a method that works everywhere. And that's one of the things we have shown. But we showed it first, and then from that we derived the method. So it's kind of interesting how that happens. So now just the basics. I'm just going to go over the basics of effectuation very quickly. There are 5 principles, and the key to each principle is that it minimizes your reliance on prediction. Okay, the first one. So when you minimize the reliance on prediction, you get not just causal and effectual. You actually can get 4 different attitudes, right? Because you can have this 2x2 of high on or low on prediction, high and low on control. So normally we think prediction is directly related to control, but if you split it apart, you can get a 2x2. So you can get visionary strategies that are high on prediction and high on control, adaptive strategies that are low on both, and this is the favorite of my MBA students, which is you try to gather all the possible data and put a spreadsheet and analyze it. You're trying to find the best possible strategy, right? So that's causal. And then you have the effectual strategy, which is all about controlling a future you cannot predict. So now for the principles, okay? By the way, the slides will be available to you, I'm hoping, right? So if you want, you can get a copy of the slides, it's not a problem. So the first principle is bird in hand. So you don't start with an effect that you want to create. So let me just give you the names of the principle and then describe each one. So bird in hand, affordable loss, crazy quilt, lemonade, and pilot in the plane. So bird in hand is the idea that you don't have to have a brilliant idea with a large predicted market opportunity to begin with. So the issue of applying effectuation to opportunities I always find very funny, because one of the things with effectuation is effectuation makes the opportunities, right? But you're absolutely right. Inside your bird in hand, you can have opportunities. In fact, it's almost an attitude towards whatever things are within your control and seeing them as full of opportunities. So that is an application that we should talk about. So you don't have to start with a very clear goal or an effect or a large market or an opportunity. You can just simply start with who am I, what do I know, whom do I know, and you start asking yourself, what can I do with this? Given who I am, what I know and whom I know, what can I do with it? And if you come up with a couple of things you can do with it, the way you choose which one to do is based on your affordable loss. So you're not trying to calculate the expected return. You're definitely not doing some projected future cash flows and then projected risks and then calculate the risk-adjusted net present value of all your cash flows and then pick the one with the bit higher NPV. You are not doing that, right? Even though these expert entrepreneurs I studied were actually billionaires running very large companies, they said when they would start a company, they would not calculate the expected return. They're just going to look at what can I afford to lose? What am I willing to lose to do this project? So affordable loss does two things, right? On the one hand, it keeps the downside within your control. Each person can decide, and we will all be different in our decisions on what we think we can afford to lose or what we are willing to lose. But it also forces you to think about the upside differently. Because you're not asking yourself, oh, I should do this because I think this will be a $2 billion company. Instead, you're actually saying, well, I don't know how big it will be, but would I want to do it even if I lose whatever it is that I am willing to lose? So it allows you to think about the upside, the project itself, very differently than only in terms of expected return. So now, day one, you can do a little assessment of your birds in hand. You can do a decision on what you are able and willing to lose, right? What is your affordable loss? Day two, you start talking with other people. Now you come to the Ask project, right? You start working with other people. And what you're doing when you're working with other people is you're talking to them in such a way that people who want to work with you self-select into the process. And whoever comes on board and what they choose to do becomes the thing that you actually do in building the venture. So now you can see that there is a process of self-selection here, not targeted stakeholders. So the crazy quilt idea is, it's not your vision of the company that you're building, right? You are working with whoever wants to work with you, and you're stitching together this network of stakeholders. And what that thing that you're building will be is something that will emerge through the process in some ways. So that's a crazy quilt principle. But if you build a venture this way, there's still things outside your control that's going to impact you, right? So life will throw lemons at you. And in America, they say when life throws lemons at you, make lemonade. So these expert entrepreneurs get very, very good at making lemonade. And then the most important thing that they learn is this idea that the future can be shaped and co-created. That this future is not already given. It's not, the history is not running on autopilot. Right? What human beings do matters. Even if you build a perfect autopilot plane, you still need the pilot. You need somebody, you need people, and what people do matters. And the future comes from what we decide to do, at least in a lot of the human affairs. It's not that you can just go and create whatever you want to do. It's not the visionary strategy. It's this idea that we can shape and influence and transform and, yes, actually even create the future. Okay, so this is effectuation in a nutshell. And this is the example that I've been using. This time I use a different example every time. So right now on my Brazil trip, I've just been using this. Everybody knows what this company is? Airbnb, right? Everybody knows that. So I just want to, the funny part of it, as a researcher, right? It's one thing when you write a case and you have collected the data, but I think it's more powerful when you did not write the case and it is just there, out there on the internet. I just took every picture and every event in the life of that venture. It's just there on TechCrunch. You can go and look at that. This is the way they told their own story. And I said, okay, this just perfectly maps effectuation principles. So we'll just add the principles and my job is done here. So this is Brian Chesky and Joe Gebbia. They did not write down, oh, we have a brilliant idea. We're going to make a multi-billion-dollar company where people will actually put air mattresses in their bedrooms and allow people to rent. You know, maybe they said it, maybe they didn't say it, but everybody thought it was a joke. But the fact is, they needed to pay rent. So they thought, why don't we do this? It's affordable laws, it's bird in hand, let's just actually do this. And just to make sure that people will want this, and we'll also serve you breakfast. And of course, I always laugh about this, that this is American breakfast, which means they will actually heat the milk for you, for your cereal, right? So they decided to do that. That's how they got started. So people were laughing, and then who would want to come and stay, you know, on somebody else's air mattress? Well, it turns out this guy, I think he's from India or Bangladesh, I don't know which one. He basically, so they have a real customer. Why? There are a lot of immigrants from a lot of emerging economies coming to San Francisco, either to do a job or to do business or whatever, and they're usually IT guys, and San Francisco is really expensive, nobody can afford it, cannot afford a hotel or even a motel. And people from some of these countries are okay using somebody else's air mattress too. So Amol shows up. So then they get very excited that there is a stream of people who are interested in doing this. And then they said, okay, maybe we should actually start building the venture now. And they go to their classmate, and they are in the valley after all, and so they have good technology people around them, and somebody basically puts up the website, basically the front end of the platform is built, and now they think, of course, now we have a business, you know, now that we have this cool website built by this brilliant engineer, everybody's going to come and stay, and people are going to list their apartments. This is going to happen. And as you can imagine, it doesn't happen. And nobody is willing to give them money because nobody thinks it's a good business idea or anything like that. So where do you go for seed funding? The lemons are coming, you know, fast at them. So what they do is they go to the Democratic National Convention in Denver, where Obama is running against McCain, and they just simply relabel these cereal boxes, Obama O and Captain McCain Crunch. God knows how many intellectual properties they infringed, I have no idea. But it's all in the name of political free speech, I think. So they could get away with it. And they went and sold these $40 a box at the convention. So this was their seed money, but it also gave them a lot of PR, right? They got free publicity doing this. So this was marketing. So now you would think this would work, but they did not know how many boxes to make. They did not know how much they would sell, but they had leftover cereal. But that was also affordable loss because they can serve the cereal to their customers. They kept doing that. So the PR got them a little bit of attention. So they got into Y Combinator. They even found a little bit of money from Sequoia, but no traction. The marketing is not working, the company is not working, the business plan is not working, the business model is not working. And now they think, like, what the heck do we do? And then that's when I think they are actually doing what the expert entrepreneurs are learning the hard way. Now they think, now they're really thinking about the crazy quilt, right? And the pilot in the plane. So they actually get on a plane, go to New York City, and they start knocking on doors, apartment by apartment, asking people to please list your apartment. They're literally teaching people about the website and asking them to list it. And some people begin to sign up listing the apartment. But one thing they start noticing is whenever a professional photographer comes and takes a picture of the apartment, that apartment rents. Makes sense, right? But if you are a professional photographer in New York City, this is not something you want to be doing, taking pictures of apartments. So one or two people might do it as a favor, hundreds of them are not going to do it. And they're thinking, how do you convince them? And they cannot afford to pay these photographers either. And so here is the crazy quilt and pilot in the plane in action. So what they say is, they go back to, like, what is it that we know how to do? We are tech people. So they build a platform for photographers. So the first successful venture they built is actually a photography platform. So the professional photographers can do the marketing to the site. They can get better jobs and better freelance assignments through the site. And it is that's what kicks off the growth of the company. And then, of course, the rest is sort of history, okay? So this is my sort of introduction to Effectuation. But if you want me to continue talking, I can and get into the Ask project. But I can also take a breath here. And do you have any questions or things you want to ask? Whether it's on the research front, or whether it's about the method, or about the basics of Effectuation. Let me take a couple of questions. I'm not quite sure what we're doing on time. How are we doing on time?
Oh, we have plenty of time.
Oh, have plenty of time. So we can definitely take a few questions, and then I'll talk about the Ask project.
I need to tell you one thing. Because you have the people that are translating, I do need you to give the microphone to the people that's gonna put the questions, okay? Okay,
And,
the first is here.
And I don't have an earphone for translation, so maybe you have to translate if the question is not in English.
Thank you for being in Brazil and for very nice presentation. I would like to understand from where does it come, those 200 plus companies for your research? This was the small ones or big ones? Does it come from India or US or?
Yeah,
Thank
sure.
you.
So the original study is only expert entrepreneurs, right? There were 245 people who qualified. And who is an expert entrepreneur? Somebody who has 10 or 15 years full-time experience starting and running companies. They've started multiple companies, including successes and failures, and taken at least one company public. That was the original study. Since then, we have 200 case histories that we have written. And those are every kind of venture you can imagine. Small business, family business, international business, low-income business, social enterprises, even Josiah Wedgwood, even through history. And they are from every country you can imagine, all the major countries, all the major continents. So the 200 case histories are truly diverse because we were trying to show generalizability. So here is the stuff the expert entrepreneurs are learning, right? Then we want to show that everybody is actually using it, everybody who has experience. Because even if you never take a company public, but if you have been running a company for 15 years, you're probably an expert. It doesn't matter if you've not built a multi-billion-dollar company, right? So we want to generalize it. But we were not looking at novices, right? We were literally looking at companies, people who had experience, but we are looking at every possible background, men, women, we have looked at disabled entrepreneurs, you know, all kinds of things. Sorry, people have to run up and down.
Hi.
Yes.
Herbert Simon was your sponsor?
He was my advisor, yes.
Your advisor. And I never found any paper associating effectuation directly with heuristics and bias in decision making. I would like to know if there's any reason for that, because it's an issue that made me instigate.
I understand. You are asking the question that Jim March asked me in the early stages. He said, why is this about entrepreneurship? His question was, why is this not about human behavior? Why are you publishing in Journal of Business Venturing, right? So in the initial stages, I did publish one paper with, co-authored with Herbert Simon in Journal of Economic Behavior and Organization. But that was before I had worked out the theory of effectuation. That is one heuristics paper. But the way I thought about it is, this was my decision, right? My advisors were all saying I should do. So one of the things I thought about it was, first of all, for me, even then, because of my personal background, I think entrepreneurship is one of those underestimated phenomena. In fact, not only, I actually think that economics should be a sub-discipline of entrepreneurship. I know everybody thinks I am nuts, but I think entrepreneurship is like a fundamental phenomenon. And that phenomenon did not have a core kind of theoretical model. And this data came from there. So I said, I'm going to start in entrepreneurship. And then sooner or later, if the idea really is good, the psychologists and the sociologists and the economists are going to get on board. And that's what's happening. So it's a conscious choice I made that I'm going to focus on entrepreneurship. And then we have written papers connecting it, but I have not tried to target, for example, behavioral journals or psych journals or anything like that. I have written in economics just because sometimes an editor literally will email you and say, why haven't, so like you said, write a paper on connecting effectuation with heuristics, connecting entrepreneurship with heuristics, and then I will write one, right? So, but all my effort I wanted to do one thing well, right? And that itself is ambitious, I think. So it was my choice to focus on entrepreneurship, but now it is happening. In fact, I'm getting papers to review from political science. I'm getting papers to review, people are beginning to look at it, not just in behavioral psychology, but just regular psychology papers. Social psychology is very interested. So I know it is coming and I know it will develop and they don't even need me. You will write the paper.
Okay,
Right?
thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes.
There's a big, deep question about planning versus acting in philosophy, etc. This goes very deep.
Yes.
If you can predict the future or even or not, control it in some extent. Seems that your approach has to do with that. So my question is about if there is some source of businesses or activities that your method would say fit and be appropriate, and others that planning would be more appropriate. In other words, if your method in proposal does not conflict or eliminate the method of planning for other sorts of companies.
Yes.
In other words, if you have a swimming line, well, your method is appropriate, and in other swimming lines for other methods, including planning. Could you comment on that?
Absolutely. In fact, I was giving a talk in the morning today to half the audience was corporate managers, and here was my last slide to them, right? If you think the future is predictable, and in many cases you know your business very well, like if you're Coca-Cola, you can pretty much predict how much you're going to sell the next quarter, right? So if you think the future is predictable, use causal methods, use planning. If you think the future is unpredictable, you're introducing a new product in the market, or you're going to introduce a new technology, then use effectuation. The interesting thing is, if you don't know whether it is predictable, if you have doubts whether it's predictable or not predictable, then use effectuation. And the interesting thing was, because effectuation, as you pointed out, can work very well with causation. But if you make a mistake, which error should you choose? And you think about that. If the future is actually not predictable, but you believe it's predictable, and you plan and you invest resources, basically you're going to Vegas. You're placing a bet, right? And when you have fiduciary responsibility for other people's money, and you have large amounts of money, large corporations, you don't want to be choosing that as your error. Choose the opposite error. Maybe the future is predictable, but you are treating it as though it is unpredictable, so you're only investing what you can afford to last, and you're building a network of stakeholders. If it is predictable, you will learn very quickly. And then you have the resources anyway, and you can come in and plan too. So that's the idea. So, of course, there are many situations that are predictable, and you should predict and use causal methods. You should use planning. But there are many situations where the future is unpredictable. But make sure that if you're not sure, make sure you're choosing an error. And which error do you want to choose? And there the expert entrepreneurs say, choose effectuation. And they have very good reasons, and I've actually written about this a little bit. But I don't want to spend all the time. Yeah.
Okay, this last remarks is about type 1 or type 2
Yes,
or
absolutely.
false positive or false negative.
Absolutely.
That's very well known in
Absolutely.
statistics and in
Because you can still have control over the choice of the error,
The
right?
question is remarks some sort of diagnosis
Yes.
about the situation or you put
Absolutely.
your entrepreneur. Okay,
Absolutely.
thank you.
On the money, you're correct.
Professor, according to the effectuation principles, you say about the successful entrepreneurs that they have lower control about the events. It is a skill to work in the third step, crazy killed,
Yeah.
to work in a network, because in a network you don't have too much control.
Ah.
You are part of a network. It's a skill
Yeah.
for
You know,
people.
you're raising a very important and interesting question. What the heck do you mean you have control, and when you do the crazy quill, when you're working with other people, you're going to bring them on board as partners, of course you lose control, right? So how does that work? So that is why the crazy quill became the focus of the next project. Like, how do you do this? Because every other principle, you're working with things within your control to some extent. But in Crazy Quill, I'm asking you to give up control. And my students raise this issue all the time, that they don't want to partner. So this allows me to go to this for a second. Let me just, this is just the dynamics, and it allows you to see your question a little bit more clearly, and I'm going to answer it too. So here we go. So you start with who I am, what I know, and whom I know. And you say, what can I do with that? And especially, what can I do for affordable loss? And then you start interacting with other people, right? So I always say this is day one. Day two, you're going to start working on the crazy quill. You're going to start talking to people. And what are you trying to do when you're talking to them? You're not doing research. You're not just trying to find information and advice, although information and advice are good things. What you're trying to do is you're trying to get commitments from these people. So you are going to work with people who put real skin in the game in your venture, right? So these are real partnerships that you're going to be negotiating. So which means you have to know how to structure that. It is a skill, but there are also techniques in that on how we can structure the relationship. There's a whole bunch of research to be done just inside. How do you, so the Ask project is, how do you even get to somebody who can put real skin in the game when you are a nobody with nothing, right? Just asking people, the techniques of asking. And then assuming they actually want to work with you, they want to become a stakeholder, how do you structure that relationship? That's the equity project. So there is more work in here. But the idea here is, so your question about control is, the moment you go and start talking to people, yeah, sure, some people are actually going to say, no, I'm not interested. It's very, very rare that somebody is, oh my God, this is awesome, I will buy your product, or I will invest in it, or I will make the product for you. That is very rare, it almost never happens. But the really interesting thing starts, first of all, if you know how to have these ask conversations, people will start saying, oh, you want to, so suppose I go and say, I want to make this, right? People will start saying, you know what, that sounds interesting, but I don't think, they will say something as to why this will work, this will not work, or they'll say, you know what, this is black is so boring, maybe if you did it in red, then I might be interested. So that's the kind of thing you're going to get from people. So now what do you do when that happens? Okay, so there are 4 kinds of responses that you can have. One is you persist, right? Because this is your baby, this is your dream. You're going to make it black. And you're going to, if you don't want black, I'm going to find somebody who wants black and I'm going to sell it, right? That is one way, and it's high in prediction and high in control, because you believe that there are people who will want black, and you can keep it under control, you can do it your way. Or you can go the other extreme, right? We teach people now in strategy all these adaptive, agile, nimble strategies. So the idea is, oh, the customer wants red, so let's go make red, okay? Because we talked to a customer and that person said they want red. So that is, one way, it's adaptation. or customer inputs, or however, depending on the model and framework you're using. So you can do that. Or you can do what my MBA students do. I'm going to talk to everybody. Somebody wants red, somebody wants green, somebody wants a thicker one, a thinner one, somebody wants environmentally friendly, and somebody wants something which has 7 other functionalities that this doesn't have. And you get all this information and you put it and you start thinking which is the one that I can build. This will be the largest market with the least, with the highest growth rate, but which I can actually become a leader in, or you have some Porter analysis or some analysis you do, and then you decide. Now here's what the expert entrepreneur will do. The expert entrepreneur will say, oh, so you think that if I make it red, it would be interesting. Huh? Why do you think that? And if you were building this, would you make it red? And then you would say, yeah, of course, and here is why I would make it red. And you could give some reason for whatever that is, right? And that reason usually will be connected with who you are, what you know, and whom you know. Because you would think that because you have somebody who knows some customer who wants to buy red. So I give this example in this thing, or people who say, I have people who have visual disabilities in my family, and they cannot really distinguish between certain colors, but they can see red, or something like that. Is some reason why you think that it should be red, that if you were building it, you would make it red. So the expert entrepreneur will understand that, and they will ask, okay, so come along with me, let's make this red. So tell me what you can do to help me make it red. And if you actually put some skin in the game, if you say, oh, if you make it red, I will introduce you to this other company that wants red pens for their promotion, or they want red pointers, or whatever your thing is, if you say that, then I will think about making it red. Because now you are underwriting making it red. So together we will make a red pointer. Okay? So that's what they're trying to do. So it's not about just simply giving away shares in my company. It's about this idea of co-creating the future. And you are investing what you can afford to lose based on your burden hand. I'm investing what I can afford to lose based on my burden hand. But together now we can do something that neither of us could have done alone. And that's the idea here. So what happens is every time somebody gives you something, even if it's a small something, but it can't be just information, it has to be more than information. You start getting new means. So now it is the two of us together can call somebody, right? So the two of us together are going to market it or produce it or hire somebody to do it or whatever. So the two of us together start building it. But along the way, we still don't need to build it. We can now talk to the next person. And then that other person underwrites another piece of it. But in the process, what you're building changes. So the product you're building changes, the business model changes, and literally the world changes, right? So the idea is that impacts your affordable loss, what you can and cannot do down the road. But the thing is, the thing that the two of us can do together has to be more important to both of us than what I originally wanted to do, right? So you're not giving up control, you're changing your goal, but you're not really giving up control, you're co-creating and you're figuring out how do we structure the relationship so both of us have control, both of us have control over the downside, and both of us can create a much better upside. Along the way, a whole bunch of things will come your way and they will impact your burden hand and your affordable loss. But we have shown in the cases that with about 5 or 8 of these stakeholders coming on board, you can build not just new ventures, but entire new markets. So now I'm going to talk about the Ask project, which is inside this. How you approach, how you have this conversation in such a way that the other person co-creates with you, and yet they are investing no more than they can afford to lose. But you also have to think about the control of the upside, which is the equity project. How do you structure equity relationships without having to share the necessarily, you don't have to really give shares in the company, but you can share revenues, you can share market share, you can bundle branding strategies. There are multiple ways in which you can set up that equity structure. So equity is not only about shares in the company. Equity is really about sharing the upside. how do we share the upside? Because the downside we are going to each of us control by investing nothing more than we can afford to lose. So here's what happens in terms of performance in this thing, right? So what happens is, it's not a question of whether you succeed or fail. The question is, if you succeed, right, you're much more likely to come up with something innovative and hence a larger market. If you fail, every single person loses no more than they can afford to lose. So the costs of failure go down, but the probability of innovation increases, and nobody needs to know what this thing will be ahead of time. So prediction is minimized. Now, did I answer the question, or do you want more practical depth to what I am saying? Because there is also practical depth if you want. Okay, good?
Professor, here.
Oh, yes.
Do you know if there is a model for measuring effectuation in emerging countries? And another one, do you see any relation between effectuation to frugal innovation or low-cost innovation?
Yeah. Answer to both is yes. So first of all, the special issue that's coming out has a review of all the measures that are out there, and there are a couple of papers in there that actually use the measures in emerging economies. So you can literally read the paper, you can talk to the author. So the metrics, they're not perfect metrics because this is still new, people are still creating metrics, but they are developing the metrics better and better. Now there are 4 different metrics out there, and some of them have actually been measured in Kenya and Sri Lanka, and I forget where else. But definitely the answer to that is yes. And of course, in a place where you don't have much, right, low-income places, even inside developed countries, but developing countries, you will find direct connections with frugal innovation and effectuation, because effectuation actually argues that every single human being on earth can actually innovate and come up with products and services that other people will pay money for. So that's the extreme argument that I would make to you. And frugal innovation is the minimum you can do, right? Yeah.
Yes, I'm here. Sorry.
Oh, here.
Yes. I find very useful your theory since I entered in contact with your materials, papers. But I just have one question that I would like to ask you is the birding hand principle and the crazy quilt. To what extent the way you think on both principles doesn't put to your dream a sort of ceiling?
Mm-hmm.
My feeling, and I may be wrong,
I'm pretty sure you are.
no, I may be wrong or I'm wrong, sure, is I can see in your perspective very much the perspective of the individual, building new context, new futures.
Okay.
But the individuals are very much able to build on the basis of the capabilities and resources.
Sure.
And this is not just something that depends on their own desires, depend also on the context.
Yes.
And based on some experiences of, for instance, poor entrepreneurs that they were able to change the reality based on their ventures, they were, for instance, taking into consideration the principle of crazy quilt. They were, at the very beginning, as you say, they enacted the venture by talking with their social networks, their close contacts. But after that first stage, they started to be more strategic.
Of course.
Other words, they were face a ceiling in the growth or in the development of the project. And they are very much these middle businesses you talk about that I share your criteria, your perspective. To what extent, if you teach to the students how to behave, how to build their ventures, this birth principle, this crazy quality, could limit their own possibilities?
Excellent question, and that is the genesis of the entire Ask project. And so one of the things I wanted to, this is why the bird in hand is different from the crazy quilt. And let me see, what did I have on the next one? Yeah, so you got me to that next slide. So, so one of the things is, in the bird in hand principle, you are just working with people you know, right? But in the crazy quilt, the whole idea is to go beyond the people you know. So at the heart of the crazy quilt is the ask. And who do you ask? You ask anyone and everyone. For example, one of the assignments I give my students is, next time you are on a plane, turn to the person sitting next to you and ask them for $100,000. And the idea is you have to learn how to ask, because it's not an easy thing to ask somebody for money, right? If you feel uncomfortable with 100,000, ask 500. But if you ask for 500, I want to see the 500, right? If you ask for 100,000, you didn't get it, it's fine. But if you, but the idea here is, first of all, how do you ask? And the plane assignment is a good one because they're stuck with you for an hour at least in many cases. But it's affordable loss for you, because if you don't do the assignment, you're failing my course. And hopefully you will walk off the plane. If it becomes embarrassing, you never see them and they never see you. Okay? So that's one example. But you can think about this in the poor context. The idea is, first of all, put yourself, go into places where there are people that you do not know but who have resources. But don't wait to find, is this the right person? Is there anybody you can ask? Ask. And my job is to teach you how to ask. And you can come up with, you can tell me, if I want to ask this person, then the next step I also teach you, how do I actually get to even meet that person? So the Crazy Quilt is really, the Ask project is really not about asking who you know. And this, a lot of this, there is a lot of practical materials we have developed, but I also did this research with 250 small business owners across the US, most of them not in the big cities. They're running really small businesses with 4 people or less, and these were selected by American Express as people who wanted to grow their business, but they had this problem. They wouldn't trust anybody, they don't want to partner with anybody. And so I went around the country, I taught them basics of the Ask, and then I asked them to call me 5 minutes a day for 60 days in a row and tell me about their ask. So I said, if I have to teach you to ask, I have to know what is the problem. I have to know a lot more about your life. So these people called, and Amex gave me the system, so the voicemails would come in. Every day we created an order. They just had to punch one button on their mobile phone and they'd leave the message. And let me tell you, many of them would talk for 45 minutes, an hour, not just 5 minutes, because they just have it on the phone while they're driving and they're talking, right? So I learned a lot about what small business people are going through. So a lot of them don't want to get rejected. A lot of them don't want to partner with people, and they struggle with asking. They struggle with what to ask, whom to ask, when to ask, how to ask, all of those things. But because we had actually taught them a lot of, so they had committed to asking, right? So we learned a lot about what happened when they asked as well. So not just their fears, but also what happened and what kinds of embarrassing things happened, or where they, came back and said, no, I can't do this. But the funniest and most important result in the study was they panicked when somebody said yes. So they've been dreaming of this. There's some big contract, getting a distributor or exporting to another country. And then because of the Ask project, they learned how to ask. And then the person says, and then they panic completely. Because now they have to say either no, or now they have to change their life, right? So the Ask project is all about that. Because when I started teaching the Crazy Quilt, you're absolutely right. Everybody just assumed that you only have to talk with whom you know. It's just about your existing social network. No, the Crazy Quilt is about creating your network, right? Building this growing quilt, which means you have to talk to strangers. And you don't know whether those people are good or bad or whatever. So all the issues of trust. And so I have a whole type 1, type 2 error theory of trust. And now I have an affordable loss way of structuring the relationship. So the way you trust is not to have only a third-party arbiter. You are your own third-party arbiter. So you invest only, come up with an affordable loss project and actually try it with that person. And then you're testing for certain things, right? And if it works, then you go to the next step. And both of you should have real skin in the game. And then people feel embarrassed that they don't know how to talk about this. Like suppose, for example, it's usually a slightly older and usually like a woman who's running a business and she's been doing it for 10 years or whatever, and suddenly, you know, there is this thing called social media that happens that she doesn't know how to do, and now she has to, and I tell her, she usually goes to her kid, and that is okay, but I tell her, if you want to do it professionally, you have to learn how to do it, right? So you have to find somebody, maybe somebody who's a college kid or something, who can actually help you do this, but you don't know what the heck they're talking about, right? So you have to make this relationship with somebody, and I'm telling you, you cannot pay for it. Because you can, how many people can you pay for it? They don't deliver. So you have to now have this conversation with people and you say, you're very, very good at this. If you come on board and do this for me, I can increase my sales, but I don't want to give you any money up front. Let's think about, you know, how you can build it. And then people, they don't want to build it. Now you have to convince them. So you make deals. You make deals with professors. You're talking with college kids. Or you start thinking about the technologist who has the job and say, can you give me 6 weekends to work on it? And then whatever extra money I make through this, right? You and I will measure it together, and then you can have, you know, 30% of it, 50% of it. So to get to the structure of the deal, that is the equity project. So this is how we're building out this thing. We kind of know what, at high level what the answers are, but we need to think about practically what are people actually doing, what are they struggling with, and what do we need to be teaching them. That's what we're doing in the Ask project. And we looked at the 250 small business owners, and we also interviewed, we have 85 interviews with Inc. 500 entrepreneurs, right? The insights that we got from that study, we have created experiments literally to test it, right? Am I correct in thinking it's a trust issue? Now I can test that through an experiment, and that we are doing with 600 entrepreneurs in India. Why in India? Because in India, whenever I go, they keep asking me to do this, and when I do it, usually 600,000 people show up, and I tell them, okay, I'll do it for free, but you've got to participate in the study, right? Yeah, all of us do it. So I do that. And so this is what we are building out here, right? That we are literally building how just through practicing the ask, you can build the expertise. The ask is the unit of deliberate practice in building expertise. So we start with novices. So this is a standard expertise curve, right? You start as a novice, initiate, apprentice, journeyman, and then you become an expert. So now we have data on this. Just start asking. That itself moves the novice from this to the initiate. But if you want to get to a journeyman, you have to learn how to make these asks where you are allowing other people to self-select in, but you are still doing it for affordable loss, and you are also learning how to structure the relationship. And here's just some preliminary results, because we had a range of entrepreneurs in the small business owner study. And so we could see just by looking at the number of asks they made, did they make any open asks, which means like a first set of effectual asks. And then we came up with a measure and a score, and then you can look at the sample here. I'm just giving the summary. But the more experienced they are, you can see they were much more likely to make effectual asks, even within that population of small business owners. And that is what Allianz Emprendedora here is translating. They have a whole bunch of things based on the ask that they're teaching low-income entrepreneurs. So so we're beginning to collect data even in some of the poorest areas, uneducated areas, and things like that. But the 3 studies that I mentioned earlier are where a lot of the data is beginning to come up. That's because those studies are completed. We are in analysis stage, but we're also collecting other data. Okay, long answer to your question.
Here?
Yes.
Professor, I would like to, if you can speak a little bit about matching, if we start to understand the entrepreneur process with your approach, I think it's needed to to change the way we make policies for entrepreneurship. Here in our state, we have a famous program similar to Spirit.
Yeah.
So how you can make better policies that understand the entrepreneurial process with this approach of effectuation? This is my I'm thinking about.
I know, it's a tough task, right? Because policymakers and people in the government are really at the other extreme end of causal thinking, because they have to be, because they're accountable for the money they spend, and they have to show that this works. And so one of the things when you start working with policymakers, and I started working with policymakers a while ago in Sweden actually, and one of the things I realized is that we have to start by questioning how they're defining their goals, right? So then that immediately gave the idea that you have to build your relationship with the policymakers also effectually, right? So the idea is really question it. So when people say that we are trying to encourage entrepreneurship courses, you have to ask them, at what level will you teach the courses? Why are we teaching only in graduate school, or why are we teaching only in incubators? So the issue really is they have to have a reason on what basis, and you will find very quickly almost all their basis is something like Silicon Valley, right? It's just something that came from the US, or some US professor, as a US professor who is doing this, I'm telling you, some US professor just sold them a bill of goods. That's where it comes from. So the first question you have to ask is, does that make sense, right? Did Silicon Valley actually start that way? Do you know a single example of somebody who has actually built an ecosystem or built an entrepreneurship education thing based on the policy you are implementing? Show me your data. So as a researcher, you rely on your strengths, which is research. Ask them, on what basis are you choosing your goals? And then, once you raise an issue, also offer them, how would you choose goals, right? So we have to do that work in terms of, so otherwise we are also caught up in trying to get funding from them, and it's all part of it. That's how the life works. But I think the way I started asking them is to really say, be more open in the selection of your goals. For example, they would immediately take a bunch of money. They have the EU and Sweden would put in a bunch of money, and then there will be some investors who will come and match the money, and then they will go into this VC mode, venture capital mode, where they're going to select these ventures and they're going to give them the money so that all these high-tech companies will come, right? And mostly many of them are scientists, things like that. And I told them, have you taken a look at the performance metrics of venture capitalists? In the US, which has the strongest venture capital industry, out of 500,000 ventures that actually are employers, create jobs, less than 1,000 will get any VC money. 9 out of 10, 90% of those will fail. Whereas when you look at the 500,000, most of whom got no VC money, half of them survive 8 years or longer and they create jobs. Okay, so why is the VC model the best model? Now if you look at companies that went public, only about 27% of them got any VC money. So 2/3, 3/4 of the companies that are going public are doing it without VC money. So we have to go to our strength and ask them, on what basis are you doing this? And this is one of the things that Bruno Rondani, who started 100 Open Startups, right? Alice's student. So his idea was to really he said, I'm going to take your idea seriously, Sarah, and I'm going to say, instead of funding, let's do corporate partnerships. Because he asked, where are these people getting funding from? And it turns out a lot of them, corporate customers are funding them. Think about Microsoft. Who funded Microsoft? Not VCs or investors. IBM funded Microsoft, right? IBM was their customer, and they underwrote the software which they went and sold to everybody else. So I think the easiest way to tackle policy is for you to educate yourself on the research side and be critical, but also be gentle in your criticism and always offer alternatives. And then again, slowly some people will change. It will not happen overnight. But a few people will change, and then now you have data. You can say, some people are doing this and some people are doing that, and you can now argue, why don't we do more of this? And that's how I do it. It's a long term. Anything worth doing takes time and effort.
Is enough? I think we should be gentle with Professor Saras, because I know she had a very heavy day. She has been with many people today, hundreds of people. So, huh?
I always
Oh,
like.
you want to? Do you want to play the video?
Yeah, I always like to end my presentations not on my voice, but the voice of an entrepreneur.
Okay,
So
so
I brought it's just a 90-second video.
So you could go with this, and then we'll have some final
we
words.
can finish. So I'll just show the video, so it doesn't end on my voice. So we talked about the Ask project a lot. So one of the things my students asked earlier on, you're saying all these things, and I know you are a big researcher and you travel around the world and everything, but I don't think Steve Jobs would ever ask anybody for anything. I'm like, oh my God, now I have Steve Jobs has become data for me, right? So I said, let me go look. Did Steve Jobs ever ask? And then another student in class, I'm worrying about this because next day I have to go to class and talk about Steve Jobs, which I don't care, right? The average billionaire is not interesting to me. If they learn some lessons, then I'm interested in that, and I want to teach it to the average nobody, right? That's what I really care about. And if maybe Steve Jobs was brilliant and he would never ask anybody, and like, it doesn't help me, it doesn't help the student, right? But because the student raised the issue, I'm worrying about it. And then another student emails me this clip. So I'm just going to share with you. This is Steve Jobs on the Ask.
No, I've actually always found something to be very true, which is most people don't get those experiences because they never ask. I've never found anybody that didn't want to help me if I asked them for help. I always call them up. I called up, this will date me, but I called up Bill Hewlett when I was 12 years old, and he lived in Palo Alto. His number was still in the phone book. And he answered the phone himself. He said, yes? He said, hi, I'm Steve Jobs. I'm 12 years old. I'm a student in high school, and I want to build a frequency counter. And I was wondering if you had any spare parts I could have. And he laughed, and he gave me the spare parts to build this frequency counter, and he gave me a job that summer in Hewlett-Packard, working on the assembly line, putting nuts and bolts together on frequency counters. He got me a job in the place that built them. And I was in heaven. And I've never found anyone who said no or hung up the phone when I called. I just asked. And when people ask me, I try to be as responsive, to pay that debt of gratitude back. Most people never pick up the phone and call. Most people never ask. And that's what separates sometimes the people who do things from the people that just dream about them. You gotta act. And you've got to be willing to fail. You've got to be willing to crash and burn. With people on the phone, with starting a company, with whatever. If you're afraid of failing, you won't get very far.
Okay. Now I ask to Professor Thales, please, to give this to Professor Saras as a certificate for giving us this wonderful keynote.
Okay.
Flashes, please. Okay. And we do have something.
It is in Portuguese.
It's in Portuguese, yeah.
No, I love it. Thank you.
Okay. And it's just a sweet thing for you to remember us on your way back. And
The first sweet thing I'm going to remember is you.
okay. So I told her about Cacao Show.
Yes.
Yeah. And that is, oh yeah, I remember. So as this guy, that Alexandre Costa, started his own business in an effectuation way. So I told her, and she's very anxious to do this case in Brazil, and we are anxious too. Yeah. So this is for you, Cacao Show, a whole box of plenty of things with the gourmet chocolates that he developed. In the beginning, it was just a more kind of popular chocolate, but now they are developing as the gourmet ones. So, for you. And this is in the name of us, an EGEPE, Fundação Getúlio Vargas, and also Unicamp. Okay? Please, before, antes que vocês debandem, a gente tem um coquetel, a gente tem aí deixa eu dar algumas palavrinhas. Não podemos esquecer os nossos apoiadores institucionais. Nós temos a Associação Comercial de São Paulo, a Rede Mulher Empreendedora. Ana Fontes está aí? Tá, Ana Fontes. Nós temos também o Centro Sebrae de Referência Educação Empreendedora, o pessoal está lá. Nós vamos ter um painel sobre educação empreendedoras e também a FAPESP, tá? Lembrem, jantar amanhã à noite, por favor, é por adesão. Lá no credenciamento, quem se interessar, pague R$70, just around the corner, lá no Hotel Wall Street, no Tulipa, amanhã, tá? Oi? Não entendi. Nós temos música, nós temos um pesquisador famoso do bricolagem, professor Reed Nelson, que também tem outros aspectos para nos mostrar, e é ele que vai fazer a música do nosso coquetel, tá? Então, por favor, tem também as inscrições das visitas técnicas, que tiveram que ser adaptadas e negociadas em função do jogo, tá? Mas elas vão acontecer, eu tive que substituir a do Cubo pelo CETEC, tá? Então, vamos lá para o coquetel. Obrigada, boa noite, e continuemos por um 10º EGEPE muito bom, tá?